Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the heart of ancient Persia, not to conquer, not to trade, not even to pray, but to chill. Literally. Picture it, you're standing in the middle of a scorching Iranian plateau, and the sand beneath your sandals is so hot it might cook bread. The sun is relentless, the air dry as old scrolls, and every breath feels like you're sipping from a clay oven. And yet, in the distance, there's a glint. A cup clinks softly. And someone is handing you a bowl of chilled rosewater syrup topped with fresh snow. Yes, snow. In the desert. You probably won't survive this trip without sweating through at least 4 layers of linen, but it's worth it. Because somehow, the ancient Persians cracked the code of cooling. They built ice houses. They made sorbets. They turned physics into dessert. And they did it without fans, without Freon, and certainly without waiting for modern science to catch up. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what time you're tucking in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in an ancient Persian city, maybe Ray or Yazd or some unmarked outpost hugging the base of a dusty hill. It's late afternoon, the heat has finally started to retreat, and the scent of sun-baked clay is giving way to something unexpected, saffron, maybe cardamom, and something unmistakably cold. You pass rows of pomegranate trees. Their glossy leaves tremble in the light breeze, and the fruits hang heavy, ripe and red like they're about to burst. Somewhere nearby, you hear the soft splash of water against stone. And then you see it. The yakshal. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about why anyone in the middle of a desert would even think about frozen desserts. Ancient Persia wasn't just hot, it was cleverly, almost diabolically, designed by nature to test your commitment to comfort. Summer days regularly climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, around 40 degrees Celsius, and shade was as valuable as spice or silk. Yet, the Persians didn't settle for sweating. They engineered an entire lifestyle around temperature control, one built on cleverness, elegance, and no small amount of ambition. You wander past a street vendor preparing a sharbat. He mixes crushed herbs, mint, basil, and stirs in flour syrup. Then, with a flourish, he sprinkles a handful of snow onto the drink, watching it melt into the clay cup like magic. The snow? It was harvested weeks ago from distant mountains, stored in an underground vault, and guarded like treasure. This wasn't just about hydration. It was theater. Historians still argue whether the use of snow for chilling was purely practical or if it emerged first as a royal indulgence that trickled down. Either way, by the 5th century BCE, yes, that early, Persian elites were hosting feasts with cold drinks and semi-frozen fruit syrups. It's documented in their art, their poetry, and, amusingly, in the grumpy complaints of Greek envoys who found themselves offered cold grape infusions instead of the warm wine they were used to. But there's more than fancy drinks here. You slip inside a noble courtyard. Marble underfoot, vines overhead, and in the center, a square pool catching the moonlight. The water's surface is still. A servant ladles a cool beverage from a ceramic jug that's been buried in the earth, and offers it with both hands. The rim is cold to the touch. You nod, sip, and shiver, just slightly. It's not freezing, not like modern refrigerators can deliver. But in the middle of the desert? It's practically sorcery. One traveler's journal from the early Islamic era even notes, with slight disbelief, how Persians would serve ice water, brought down from the mountains, even in the heat of midday. Another writer claims Persian guests were offended if offered warm drinks, a lapse in etiquette, like forgetting someone's name at a dinner party. The sun finally dips below the horizon, and the real cooling begins. This was when the magic happened. You'll learn soon how Persians harvested ice from thin air, literally, but for now, enjoy the nightly rituals. Children laugh as they chase each other around columns. Grandmothers sit cross-legged, fanning themselves with palm leaves. And across the rooftops, long sheets of linen have been stretched, catching dew, reflecting heat, doing their quiet, unsung work. From a shaded alcove, a poet recites verses that compare the sweetness of chilled quince syrup to a lover's breath. It's a bit dramatic, but then again, if you tasted it, you might agree. Some scholars suggest that this entire obsession with chill began with ancient Zoroastrian reverence for balance, heat and cold, fire and water, light and shadow. There's no definitive consensus, but it's a poetic theory, that cooling wasn't just comfort, but cosmic harmony. Of course, not everyone got to enjoy these frosty luxuries. Ice was heavy, delicate, and valuable. For the average Persian citizen, a cold drink might mean water drawn from a deep cannet, an underground canal, rather than anything resembling a slushy. But on special days, at weddings or solstice feasts, you might get a chipped block of mountain snow, flavored with sour cherry or mulberry syrup. You step away from the noble courtyard and duck into a quieter alleyway. A man pulls open a cellar door and beckons. Below, you can see flickering lamplight bouncing off clay walls, and shelves stacked with covered pots. He grins and says something about tomorrow's feasting. You can already feel it, the pull of cold earth, the clever tricks of architecture, the quiet insistence that just because you live in a desert doesn't mean you must surrender to the sun. We're just getting started. You descend the narrow stairs behind that cellar door, your sandals thudding softly against the packed earth. It's immediately cooler here, noticeably, deliciously cooler. The air is dense, slightly damp, and scented faintly with cumin, clay, and citrus peel. You pass through a low arch into what feels more like a forgotten chamber than a storage room. Around you, massive ceramic jars line the walls. Some are sealed with wax, others covered with linen tied with twine. A man stoops near the back, arranging stones along a small channel that trickles with water, barely a whisper, but unmistakably running. Welcome to the ancient Persian approach to interior design, not just stylish, but thermodynamically strategic. Homes and public buildings in Persia weren't simply built to withstand the heat, they were crafted to manipulate it. The architecture here is clever in that subtle, why don't we do this anymore, kind of way. Above you, though you can't see it from this angle, sits a badger, a wind catcher. Think of it as a reverse chimney, a tall, tower-like structure with slatted openings designed to catch the faintest breeze and funnel it downward into the living space below. Wind enters the shaft, pressure builds, and warm air is flushed out while cooler currents sink through the building like silk. Historians still argue whether the badger was purely Persian in origin or if it evolved alongside similar systems in Egypt and Mesopotamia. What we do know is that Persia took it to a new level, combining wind catchers, subterranean water channels, and passive cooling design centuries before mechanical air conditioning ever hummed to life. You move deeper into the building, where the stone floors are smoother, and the walls grow thicker. Thick walls of sun-dried brick, sometimes up to 2 meters, acted like thermal batteries. During the day, they absorbed heat. At night, they released it slowly, balancing temperature like a sleepy rhythm. A servant nods to you and opens a tall wooden door. Beyond it is the central courtyard, a microcosm of Persian cool. Trees offer shade. A water basin reflects the stars. Vines climb up latticed pergolas, and the scent of jasmine carries on the breeze. Here, architecture meets atmosphere. And the secret weapon? The cannet. Running silently beneath many Persian towns, these underground aqueducts channeled water from mountain springs to homes, bathhouses, and gardens. A cannet didn't just supply water, it regulated temperature. By running water beneath floors or alongside storage walls, rooms were passively cooled. Some bathhouses even used them to create early steam chambers. Yes, they managed hot and cold rooms in the same complex. You notice, as you lean against a sun-warmed pillar, that nothing feels abrupt here. The heat doesn't slam into you, it glides. The cold doesn't shock, it whispers. Everything is gradual, like the cooling of tea left on a shaded step. In wealthier homes, walls were lined with sarouge, a waterproof plaster made with lime, egg whites, and ash. It helped seal out dust and hold in cool air. You might chuckle now, but egg white-based wall paste has outlasted more than a few modern brands. And there's more. Some homes featured underground rooms called shabestans, used primarily in the summer. You descend into one now. Low ceilings, arched alcoves, and thick walls make it feel like a private sanctuary. A small breeze snakes its way in through hidden vents connected to the badger. You sit cross-legged on a mat. Someone places a bowl beside you, cucumber slices soaked in vinegar, with a dash of salt. Cooling, hydrating, a little tangy. It's not dessert, but it's not bad. Suddenly, you hear a faint click and feel a cooler gust of air. Somewhere, a servant has adjusted a wooden flap inside the wind catcher. These flaps could be turned to direct airflow depending on time of day, season, or wind direction. It's like having a dial on nature itself. You close your eyes and listen. In the distance, a camel bell chimes. A child giggles. And somewhere far above, palm fronds whisper against the rising moon. Of course, not every structure was this elaborate. Most homes in villages relied on shaded courtyards and deep water jars stored in corners. But even modest dwellings had thick walls and airflow corridors designed to maximize comfort. One traveler from the 10th century CE wrote that walking into a Persian home on a summer day felt like diving into a shaded spring. A slight exaggeration perhaps, but after climbing dusty hills all morning, you're inclined to agree. And just when you think you've learned all the tricks, here comes another. Some builders embedded jars or clay pipes in walls to help redistribute airflow. Others painted rooftops with a pale, lime-based wash to reflect sunlight, a concept modern, cool roofing just recently caught onto. It's not just functional, it's artful. From the blue-tiled wind catchers of yaws to the honeycomb patterns cut into sunshades, everything has a purpose and a style. Historians love to speculate, did Persian architecture inspire the Andalusian courtyards of Spain? Was there knowledge transfer via Silk Road merchants? Or was it just a beautiful case of parallel innovation? No one's entirely sure. But you can't unsee the resemblance once you've walked through both. You stretch out on a woven mat inside the shabestan. A woman enters carrying a covered tray. She lifts the cloth to reveal small cups, some filled with cold melon slices, others with a soft, crushed ice tinged with honey and mint. The cold bites your teeth slightly, but the flavor? Divine. The architecture kept this possible. Long before you've seen a yakshal, long before ice gets made in a desert, the groundwork is laid here, in bricks, breeze, and buried water. Cooling wasn't an afterthought, it was a philosophy. You yawn, half full of icy melon, and wonder what genius came up with the idea of making actual ice here, ice that could last for months, even under the unforgiving gaze of the sun. That's where we're headed next. You wake, sort of. Not the kind of wakefulness where you spring into action, more the kind where your eyes open just enough to notice the early light brushing against the wall. A bird calls somewhere beyond the courtyard. The air is still cool, heavy with dawn moisture. Somewhere in the quiet, distant footsteps approach on soft sand. Someone's about to open a yakshal. You throw on a light robe and pad your way through the compound, the brick walls still holding the night's coolness. Outside, the city stretches wide and quiet. Rooftops are tinged with pink. Market stalls still sleep beneath their tarps. But you, lucky you, are heading to see a miracle of Persian engineering. And here it is, the yakshal. From a distance, it looks oddly alien. A giant beehive made of sand-colored mud brick, rising sharply against the sky like something a friendly sandworm might call home. But as you get closer, the scale hits you. It's massive, maybe 30 feet high, with walls up to 2 meters thick at the base, tapering as they rise. Inside that conical dome? Cold. Real cold. Ice cold. Yakshils, which literally means ice pit, were the original desert refrigerators. They weren't decorative. They weren't symbolic. They were practical, and honestly, kind of brilliant. See, making and storing ice in a desert isn't just difficult, it's hilariously ambitious. And yet, by the 5th century BCE, Persian engineers were doing it regularly. No wires, no compressors, just the ancient powers of insulation, geometry, and a stubborn refusal to accept warm beverages. So what makes a yakshil tick? You circle the structure slowly, noting the narrow entrance, a low, shaded opening on the northern side, always positioned to avoid direct sunlight. Near the base, little air vents poke from the walls like nostrils. These aren't random. They're part of a complex system that allows warm air to escape and cool air to settle. You duck inside. It's dark at first. Then your eyes adjust. The temperature drops immediately, at least 10 degrees cooler than outside, maybe more. You descend a few steps into the pit, your hand grazing the smooth plaster of the inner wall. Some parts still glisten with frost. In the center, a low basin carved into the floor holds a stack of what looks like thick snow, layered and packed tight with straw. This is last winter's harvest, still intact in midsummer. The yakshil works on multiple principles. First, insulation. The thick walls are made of a special material called saruj, a composite of clay, sand, ash, goat hair, and lime that's not only waterproof but heat-resistant. Second, evaporative cooling. Vents and underground airflow channels allow hot air to escape while encouraging cool air to settle. And third, geometry. That conical shape? It minimizes surface area where the sun hits, while maximizing height to allow hot air to rise and exit. Historians still argue whether the shape evolved through trial and error or was mathematically planned from the start. Either way, it works. So well, in fact, that ice stored here could last months, even in triple-digit heat. You press your hand against one of the inner blocks. It's firm, frosty, and faintly crackling as it slowly melts. There's a faint herbal smell. Someone stored mint leaves with it. Later, the ice will be broken up and served in drinks or packed around perishable foods. Some will be mixed into sharbat, some saved for medicinal poultices. A soft voice behind you murmurs something about restocking tonight. Because yes, the yakshil isn't just a storage facility, it's also where ice was made. That's right. Not just hauled in from the mountains, but created here, in the desert. You head back outside and stroll behind the structure. Here, you notice something strange, a long, shallow trench carved into the earth, shielded by a low mud wall on one side. This is the ice-making basin, and it's more magical than it looks. Here's how it worked. In the coldest part of winter, water from nearby canets was poured into these shallow pools overnight. The desert's dry air and clear skies allowed temperatures to plummet rapidly. Thanks to the principle of radiative cooling, even if the air was just above freezing, water in the trench could lose heat to the night sky quickly enough to freeze. The shallow depth helped the process along, allowing a thin layer of ice to form across the surface. Servants and workers, probably not your first choice of winter job, would then collect the ice at dawn, break it into chunks, and haul it into the yakshil, layer by layer, separated with straw for insulation. Then they'd refill the basins, and do it again. Night after night, inch by inch, the yakshil filled. This wasn't a quick process. It took weeks, sometimes longer. But it worked. All without lifting a finger to a power switch. You pause to appreciate that again. Thousands of years ago, in a desert, people figured out how to make and store ice year-round, using nothing more than mud, physics, and stubborn ingenuity. You'd like to think if you'd been there, you would have been part of that team. More likely, you'd be complaining about frozen toes and trying to sneak into the kitchen for a pre-thawed pomegranate. And while today we marvel at smart fridges and cryogenic cooling, it's hard not to be a little more impressed by a bunch of ancient engineers looking at the desert sun and saying, you know what would be great right now? A snow cone. Some yakshals were public. Others were privately owned by wealthy families or even the crown. Royal estates often had larger ones, tucked into shaded gardens, where guests could be served chilled beverages and seasonal fruit in the height of summer, because power, after all, tastes better when it's refreshing. As you walk back around to the front, a few children toss pebbles into the basin from earlier, now dry and swept. Later tonight, if the skies stay clear and the air behaves, the water will return, and the freeze will begin again. You glance at the sky. Clear, cloudless. The stars already faintly blinking their approval. Tonight looks promising. The sun hangs low in the sky now, casting a golden hush over the city. The streets are beginning to stir again after the long heat nap of afternoon. In the distance, donkeys shuffle lazily through the narrow alleys, their baskets loaded with herbs and clay pots. You follow the scent of rosewater and ash back to the yakshal, where something truly improbable is about to take place. Tonight, they're going to make ice. And no, not with a freezer. Not with magic. But with one of the most quietly astonishing processes in the ancient world, evaporative cooling and radiative heat loss, all wrapped in the deceptively humble act of leaving water outside overnight. You settle onto a clay bench near one of the shallow ice-making trenches. It doesn't look like much, a long, rectangular depression in the earth, lined with a fine clay coating and surrounded by short mud brick windbreaks. The basin is filled only a few fingers deep with still water, pulled just hours ago from the canets, those underground lifelines that keep the desert from completely winning. As night falls, the temperature starts to plummet. This is a desert truth, the same sky that scorches you at midday can chill your bones after dusk. You wrap a linen shawl around your shoulders and wait. Here's how it works. First, the dry desert air begins to sip moisture off the surface of the water. The process of evaporation steals heat. And while this only cools the water slightly at first, there's a more powerful phenomenon at play, radiative cooling. The water and the earth beneath it radiate heat into the wide, empty sky, a sky so dry and cloudless that it acts almost like a perfect heat vacuum. Historians still argue whether the Persians fully understood the science behind this. Some believe they simply noticed the pattern. Water left in shallow pools froze overnight, and built on it through generations of clever trial and error. Others argue that they possessed a deeper understanding of atmospheric cooling than we give them credit for, particularly in the high-altitude regions where yakshals thrived. Either way, the results speak for themselves. By early morning, if the stars align and the air is still enough, a thin sheet of ice will glaze across the basin's surface. It might only be a few millimeters thick, but every night adds another layer. Each dawn, workers with long-handled wooden tools will collect the delicate ice sheets, stack them with straw, and cart them carefully into the yakshal's waiting belly. And then they'll do it all again. You stretch your legs, watching as a few laborers begin preparing straw bundles for the morning harvest. They move slowly, methodically, not rushing a process that requires the patient cooperation of weather and water. One young boy carries a small clay tablet with tally marks on it, perhaps a record of how many loads of ice were added this week, or how many nights it's been since the last proper freeze. The math isn't fancy. But the logistics? As good as any modern supply chain. Here's a detail you didn't expect: in some places, water used for freezing was mixed with a trace amount of salt or natural minerals, which slightly lowered the freezing point and created denser ice. A trick still used by ice road builders and maple syrup makers today. You smile at the thought. Somehow, this dusty stretch of desert has more in common with Canadian tundras than you'd think. In wealthier areas, or particularly ambitious estates, the basins were designed with reflective stone slabs or lined with pale clay to increase heat radiation. Some had built-in channels to direct melted runoff back to the canets, recycling it to try again the next night. Efficiency was everything. And of course, not every night was a success. Cloud cover, unexpected wind, or even a rise in humidity could ruin an entire freeze cycle. Some nights, you'd get nothing but cold water and disappointment. Which meant more labor the next night. More waiting. More fingers crossed to the stars. Yet the system endured. Because it worked often enough. And when it did, it felt like cheating the laws of nature. You lean back against the low wall, letting the clay's stored warmth seep into your back as the night air brushes your face. In the distance, dogs bark once and then go quiet. Someone is singing a lullaby in a neighboring courtyard, low and melodic, maybe to a child, maybe just to herself. Suddenly, it occurs to you that this entire process, this science experiment writ large, was happening in complete silence. No gears. No smoke. No buzzing compressors. Just wind, earth, water, and sky. A little cooperation, a lot of patience. There's something deeply human about it. And something oddly comforting. In a world that often rewards speed, the Persians found a way to embrace slowness. Ice wasn't instant. It was earned. And perhaps that made it taste all the sweeter when it finally reached your lips. A middle-aged man settles beside you and points toward the basin. He makes a slashing motion with his hand and mimics cracking ice. You nod, and he nods back. No words needed. You both know what's coming tomorrow. By sunrise, those basins may hold the glittering start of 100 tiny luxuries, enough to flavor wedding feasts, nurse fevers, or simply offer a cool reprieve from the midday blast. Some say the Yakshals were temples of practicality. But sitting here, under a moon that watches all with gentle indifference, you're inclined to believe they were temples of wonder. The sun is barely a rumor on the horizon when you return to the basin. The air is dry, silent, and breathless with anticipation. Dew clings faintly to the fronds of a nearby date palm. A thin, papery sheet of ice lies quietly across the surface of the trench, so still and so pristine that you hesitate to disturb it. But then, with a soft crunch, a worker presses a wooden rake into the ice and begins to break it apart. You wince slightly, it feels like interrupting something sacred. The chunks are carefully lifted, not with the hurry of a modern ice harvest but with reverence, bundled with straw, and loaded onto a small sled pulled by an ox, the wheels creaking across the sand-packed earth. The entire scene moves like a slow-motion ballet. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is rushed. And now, that harvested ice begins its next journey, into the heart of the city. You follow a caravan of wagons and baskets as they roll through still-sleeping streets. The ice is insulated with layers of straw and thick felt, and covered with tightly wrapped linen. It's not built to last long, just long enough to get to where it needs to go. For the palace kitchens, the day begins with a sort of frosty ritual. Ice is delivered like a royal guest, brought in carefully under shaded canopies. Cooks unwrap the bundles with practiced speed, dropping chunks into bronze bowls lined with herbs, mint, basil, saffron. You watch as one cook stirs a mixture of grape must, rosewater, and a sliver of lemon over the ice, creating a slushy, fragrant delight known as sharbat. That's right, Persians were drinking flavored ices millennia before the invention of Italian sorbet or American snow cones. In fact, the word sharbat itself gave birth to the Italian sorbetto, which then became sorbet. As with so many good things in history, the trail of cool desserts leads straight back through the Persian plateau. One poet from the 10th century describes a summer banquet where guests were served snow like white peacock's feathers, drizzled with syrup of violets and chilled mulberries. It might sound decadent, but for the elite, this was a casual Tuesday. And it wasn't just nobles indulging. On special feast days or during Nowruz, ice would be brought to the main squares and shared with the public in generous ladles of sweetened, chilled drinks. People lined up with copper cups and pottery mugs, grateful not only for the relief from the heat but for the novelty, the miracle, of something cold in a place that so often scorched. You trail one of the wagons toward the outskirts of town. There, nestled in the cooler shade of the hillside, is another storage structure, not a yakshal this time, but a snow well. These were deep vertical shafts dug into the earth, where blocks of ice or snow were packed in alternating layers of straw and insulated with earthen lids. They didn't last as long as yakshals, but for short-term storage, especially in higher elevations, they did the job well. Local farmers would chip away bits to keep dairy cool or bring offerings of chilled goat yogurt to market. Historians still debate whether the use of these smaller wells predates yakshals or evolved alongside them. What's clear is that the idea of storing winter's blessings for summer's misery was a nearly universal human urge, and nowhere was it more refined than in Persia. At the royal court, chilled drinks weren't just served, they were performed. A nobleman recounts how a servant would carry a tray of ice-filled goblets, each topped with a different syrup: pomegranate, quince, tamarind, rosehip. Guests would pass them around, comparing flavors, boasting about whose region grew the sweetest plums or the spiciest ginger. The emperor himself reportedly sipped a mixture of snow and saffron infused with gold leaf. Not because gold tastes good, it doesn't, but because it sparkled in the light. Again, power peacocking at its finest. You can't help but grin. Somewhere between practicality and performance, between thermodynamics and theater, Persians made cold into something meaningful. Not just a way to survive summer, but to celebrate it. On your way back into the city center, you pass a small roadside stand. The vendor is preparing a humble version of the same chilled treat, this time with melon juice and a hint of salt. He offers you a chipped clay cup, and you accept. The drink is a little sweet, a little bracing, and entirely perfect. And for a moment, as the ice grazes your lips, it's easy to forget you're standing in the middle of a desert. Easy to forget the heat. Easy to forget time. Just you and the moment, and the knowledge that this humble delight is the result of thousands of years of engineering, ritual, and good old-fashioned trial and error. Some say the snow was brought down from the mountains by slaves or servants. Others say there were organized guilds of ice collectors, men who specialized in navigating the slippery paths of the Alborz Mountains, chipping away at snowbanks with copper picks and wrapping the blocks in straw. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. One story tells of a snow caravan that got caught in a flash dust storm halfway between the mountains and the city. The workers had to bury the blocks in sand and mark the spot with sticks, returning under the stars to dig it all back out. Did it happen? Who knows? But you can't help picturing it, a crew of grumbling men, cold to the bone, dust in their teeth, guarding a treasure that would melt if they blinked too long. And it was a treasure. Not gold, not spices, ice. Fragile, fleeting, and yet somehow more powerful than either. You return to the yakshal, watching as another cartload is unloaded. A child balances a small chunk in her hand, licking it like a pearl. Her mother laughs, wipes her face, and tosses the remaining snow into a jug of syrup for dinner. Another day of cold, captured from the sky. It's midday now, and the desert heat is back in full force, unapologetic, all-consuming, and somehow just a little smug about it. You've retreated to the cooler inner quarters of the house, where the walls are thick, the shutters drawn, and the floor tiles offer some measure of reprieve under your feet. A servant passes by with a tray, earthen cups beaded with condensation, the faintest clink of ice inside. You're not imagining it. This isn't magic. It's logistics. Because now it's time to explore the network behind Persian cooling, not just the tools like yakshals and basins, but the supply chains, the social roles, and the quiet, brilliant systems that kept the ice flowing where it needed to go. You hear the hum of voices from a shaded courtyard. There's a group of workers sitting beneath a vine-draped awning, sipping diluted yogurt drinks and comparing notes. Not written notes, verbal ones. Routes. Weather. Conditions. They're part of the ice runners, men who knew how to move fragile loads across a vast, hot empire without losing everything to the sun. Historians still argue whether these supply systems were centrally managed or operated like loose trade guilds. There's evidence for both. In some places, yakshals were owned and maintained by the state, especially near important cities like Isfahan or Yazd. In others, they were managed by merchant families or religious foundations who used them to curry favor with the community, sometimes quite literally by handing out chilled sharbat during festivals. And the actual movement of ice? Well, that depended on the season, the region, and a remarkable array of improvisation. In the colder months, large blocks of ice were packed in straw, wrapped in camel hides, and loaded onto carts or camelbacks. These caravans moved mostly at night, when the roads were cooler, and camped during the day in shaded hollows or pre-built way stations. Imagine the stress, hauling a melting commodity through 90-degree heat with nothing but fabric and prayer to slow the process. Yet somehow, they pulled it off. Some towns even had ice arrival days, like miniature holidays, when shipments from higher altitudes would come in, and people would gather to barter for their summer supply. You can picture it, wagons creaking down the main road, children running beside them, shouting, "It's here! The snow's here!" Vendors scrambling to outbid each other. And somewhere nearby, a very annoyed goat being offered in trade. You're told about a man who specialized in transporting ice wrapped in sheep's wool soaked in vinegar, an odd combination, but apparently effective. Another swore by hollow bamboo tubes layered in dried seaweed. Did it work? Maybe. Maybe not. But the sheer creativity involved is oddly comforting. Inside the palace, of course, the process was more refined. Dedicated runners, often young men chosen for their speed and stamina, were tasked with fetching fresh ice or chilled desserts from storage to banquet halls. One misstep, one delay, and a perfectly frozen plum pudding might arrive as sad purple soup. At larger feasts, servers would rotate blocks of ice beneath dishes on raised platforms to keep meats and fruits from spoiling. You can almost imagine a royal guest lifting a fig-stuffed quail and seeing a shimmering block beneath, half elegance, half overkill, and all very Persian. But outside the wealth and glitter, the system worked on a more communal rhythm. Families who couldn't afford their own yakshal would contribute labor or materials to a shared one and, in return, receive a portion of the stored ice throughout the year. A kind of ancient ice co-op. You overhear one elder explain that their grandfather used to barter honey for a handful of ice blocks during the hottest months. In villages without yakshals, clever substitutes popped up. People buried ceramic jars deep into cool earth, lining them with wet cloth and storing cooled water inside. Others used desert fridges, two-nested clay pots with damp sand in between. As the outer sand dried, it wicked heat away from the inner pot, chilling its contents just enough for comfort. Even now, in some rural areas, these pot-in-pot coolers, zirab, are still used. No electricity. No noise. Just simple physics and dusty determination. And the uses of this precious ice went beyond food. Healers mixed crushed ice with turmeric to cool fevers. Pregnant women chewed chilled tamarind paste to ease morning sickness. On the hottest nights, some families placed slivers of ice in front of wind-catcher vents to blow a hint of cold into their sleeping quarters, a kind of ancient, very moist air conditioner. One document from the 12th century mentions brides being gifted a small carved box of snow with rose petals pressed inside, meant to be placed beside her on her wedding night to ease the heat and the nerves. Imagine that. Your dowry, linens, spices, and 40 grams of perfectly aged January snow. Of course, the system wasn't flawless. Ice spoiled. Supplies ran short. In bad years, droughts, sandstorms, warm winters, the yakshals didn't fill. People rationed. Some villages fought over shares. One old tale tells of two rival ice masters who sabotaged each other's storage pits by sneaking in at night and accidentally leaving the lids ajar. Was it petty? Absolutely. Was it effective? Also yes. But more often than not, cooperation won out. You wander now through the bazaar, where metalworkers hammer decorative ice tongs and potters craft wide-lipped clay cups perfect for sharing chilled sherbet with a friend. Everything around you, from the tools to the tales, has been shaped, literally, by the presence of ice in a place where it shouldn't exist. And yet, it does. Because somewhere, someone decided that the sun wouldn't have the final say. The day is winding down again. The light has softened, and long shadows stretch lazily across the walls of the city. You find yourself in a quiet garden tucked behind a scholar's home, where vines crawl like lazy scribes up the brickwork and the air smells faintly of jasmine and lime. A brass tray rests beside you, beads of moisture sliding down the outside of a cup filled with something cold, pink, and faintly fizzy. Yes, it's Sharbat again. Tonight's version: rhubarb and basil, with a hint of ground pistachio on top. A reminder that in Persia, ice wasn't just a utility, it was an ingredient of beauty. You recline against a cushion as your host, a gentle old man with fingers stained by ink, explains how Persian philosophy and aesthetics had room for ice, not as a brute triumph over nature, but as a refinement of it. Because cold, you learn, was associated with balance, especially in traditional Persian medicine, where the concept of hot and cold temperaments guided everything from treatments to dinner menus. That means cold foods, and by extension ice, weren't just refreshing, they were restorative. So now, let's take a stroll through the culinary side of Persian refrigeration. Because these folks weren't simply storing ice for survival. They were cooking with it, crafting flavors that made heat bearable and, more often than not, turned suffering into ceremony. One of the earliest cold dishes you encounter is faluda, a slushy dessert made from thin, vermicelli-like starch noodles, soaked in a chilled syrup of sugar, rosewater, and lime juice. It's served nearly frozen, sometimes with ground cherry pits or sour cherries folded in, depending on the region. Think of it as the ancestor of Italian granita, with more perfume and poetry. Some say faluda dates back to around 400 BCE. Historians still argue over whether the earliest versions were invented in Shiraz or Ray, but what's certain is that by the Sassanid era, the dessert had spread across the empire like a delicious rumor. In fact, when Arab armies arrived during the Islamic conquests, they reportedly brought faluda recipes back with them, where they evolved into kulfi, bastani, and other regional cold treats across Asia and beyond. And speaking of bastani, Persian ice cream, it deserves its own moment. You try a dish now, bright yellow from saffron, flecked with pistachios, and elastic with salep, a powdered orchid root that gives it a chewy, almost stretchy texture. This isn't a scoop and melt affair. Bastani clings to your spoon like it knows it has dignity. And it does. Some versions are layered with frozen cream and chopped dates. Others use egg yolks and rosewater for a custardy richness that could almost pass for French pâtisserie, if not for the unexpected zing of cardamom in the finish. All of it served chilled, of course, on a ceramic dish that's been cooled in the shade all afternoon. And while sharbat, faluda, and bastani were the most famous cold indulgences, you also learn of lesser-known ones: iced almond milk with cucumber and dill, frozen barley broth with crushed sour plum, even snow-dried yogurt balls stored in cotton sacks until summer, then softened with chilled water and spread over flatbread. They didn't just use cold to preserve food, they infused cold into the food itself, crafting entire dishes around its presence. And they served it with the kind of flair usually reserved for weddings and poetry recitals. You visit one family where the matriarch demonstrates how to keep fruit chilled without ice. She wraps plums in lotus leaves and buries them in clay urns beside a Kanat's cool stream. Hours later, they emerge glossy and cold to the touch, tasting like they've been plucked from a glacier. When she smiles, you notice her hands are stained violet from crushing mulberries, used earlier in a syrup poured over snow she still swears tastes better when harvested before sunrise. Across the empire, regional cold dishes bloom like summer mirages: mint yogurt soup in Hamadan, chilled tamarind stew in Kazakhstan, and ice-swirled melon drinks in Kerman. Some were medicinal. Others, festive. But all of them point to the same truth. In a world ruled by heat, cold was a cultural art form. You sit now in the garden as a slow fan creaks overhead, casting a ripple of air across your shoulders. Someone's playing a reed flute nearby. The sharbat in your hand is nearly finished, the last ice crystals rattling gently against the clay. You swirl them once, like dice in a cup, and smile. Because this chilled, fragrant, fleeting moment, is exactly the kind of luxury that Persian engineers, cooks, and dreamers labored to create. You remember what one cook said earlier as he dropped a block of ice into a vat of fruit syrup. The best cold is not the cold of winter. It's the cold you earned in summer. And maybe that's the best way to understand Persian cooling, not just as technology, not even as tradition, but as intentional joy. A refusal to accept discomfort. A celebration of contrast. A culture that looked the sun in the eye and said, "Fine. Be hot. We'll just invent the world's most elegant workaround." You finish your drink. The flute song fades. Somewhere out there, a basin fills with water once more, the stars already beginning their quiet work overhead. The evening has slipped into night, and the city outside is a lull of soft sounds, distant dogs barking, the clink of a water jar, the occasional creak of wooden shutters settling. You wander back to the outskirts, where the large yakshul stands like a slumbering giant under the moonlight, its walls glowing faintly silver. There's a peacefulness here, but also a certain hum of activity. Even at night, the work of preserving cold never fully stops. You meet a few of the ice caretakers, the keepers of the cold, men who guard the yakshul and oversee its maintenance. Their task is less glamorous than the harvest or the feasts but no less critical. Cracks in the dome must be repaired with a special mortar made of clay, lime, and ash, designed to reflect heat and keep moisture out. One of them, an older man with a slow smile, explains how these repairs are often done in the evening, when the air is cooler and the materials set properly without cracking. You can't help but admire their dedication. The yakshul isn't just a storage unit, it's a living system. Every crack sealed, every layer of straw replaced, every water basin topped up is a small miracle against the relentless desert. Sometimes, they tell you, the biggest threat isn't heat, it's rats. These nimble creatures chew on insulation layers and even nibble at the stored ice itself. So traps, carefully concealed under straw, are a constant part of the maintenance ritual. In one tale, a caretaker recounted how a rat infestation once nearly ruined a season's entire ice supply. The men had to quarantine the yakshul for days, fumigating with smoke from burning wild herbs, a practice historians are still debating the origins of. You watch as the caretakers check the moisture content of the insulation, noting its firmness with practiced fingers. They use long poles to stir the water basins atop the dome, ensuring an even freeze overnight. The process takes hours, patience, and a steady hand. Back inside the city, you find that yakshul-inspired cooling techniques had spread to architecture itself. Ancient Persian homes often included thick walls, vaulted ceilings, and wind catchers called badgers that funneled cool air downward. Sometimes, these wind catchers were connected to underground water channels, cooling the air through evaporation before it reached the living spaces, a kind of natural, passive air conditioning. Scholars still debate the exact efficiency of these systems, but the ingenuity is clear. A favorite story involves a palace room kept deliberately chilly by an elaborate series of underground water pipes feeding ice-cold water beneath the marble floor. Guests would sit barefoot on cushioned divans, their toes numbed pleasantly by the stone. You imagine the sensation: heat outside, cool stone beneath, and the gentle hum of water flowing quietly below. Meanwhile, the ice itself played a role in medicine. Cold was used to treat fevers and inflammation, sometimes administered as crushed ice wrapped in cloth and pressed gently to the skin. You're told of a healer who mixed ground ice with crushed herbs to make poultices that could soothe sunburns or calm restless minds. One particularly poetic healer described ice as the breath of the mountains, carried gently to the city's heart. But ice also had its social layers. Access was not equal. The wealthy enjoyed chilled drinks, cold desserts, and even ice baths. The poor made do with shaded wells, thick curtains, and occasional cool sprays from clay pots. Some stories tell of communal ice-sharing festivals, where blocks were broken up and distributed to neighbors. Others hint at quiet resentment or jealousy when shipments failed or were delayed. Still, the persistence of ice culture in a place so clearly at odds with cold is a testament to human adaptability, and a reminder that comfort, like storytelling, is a shared experience. You end your visit sitting beside the Yakshal, the cool night air settling around you like a soft blanket. Somewhere inside, ice sleeps. And soon, it will wake again with the rising sun. The morning light is pale and still gentle as you return to the bazaar, now stirring to life with vendors arranging their wares and children weaving through crowded alleys. Among the familiar scents of spices and fresh bread, you find yourself drawn toward a small shop displaying an assortment of curious, cold-related artifacts. Here, you learn about the tools of the trade, the everyday items that made ancient Persian refrigeration possible beyond the monumental yakshal. First, there's the humble ice tongs. Far from simple pincers, these were often beautifully crafted, sometimes with intricate filigree or engraved motifs of frost and stars. They weren't just functional, they were symbols of status, tools wielded by servers in wealthy households or royal courts. Holding a pair feels delicate yet purposeful, like holding a piece of history wrapped in cold metal. Nearby, shelves are lined with ceramic jars, many glazed to keep water cool even without ice inside. Some jars are double-walled, with space between filled with wet sand to encourage evaporative cooling, a method surprisingly effective in the arid heat. You try your hand at lifting one, noticing how its smooth surface resists the sun's warmth just a little longer than a regular pot. It's a subtle difference, but enough to make a summer afternoon bearable. You also spot small earthenware basins designed to be partially buried underground, leveraging the cooler soil to keep contents chilled. Some are lined with natural fibers, others with powdered salts thought to enhance the cooling effect. One particularly curious object catches your eye, a carved wooden box lined with fine silk and a hollowed interior. It's said these were used to store delicate desserts or medicines, insulated against the heat by both material and design. You're told these boxes were prized possessions, sometimes given as gifts among nobles, symbolizing care and hospitality. You muse that the emphasis on craftsmanship in even the simplest refrigeration tools reflects the Persian belief in beauty and utility as inseparable. Next, your guide explains the role of natural refrigerants beyond ice itself. Saltpeter, for example, was sometimes sprinkled on stored fruits to slow spoilage, and certain herbs like mint and rose had cooling properties when combined with chilled water. There's even mention of early chemical experiments, precursors to modern refrigeration, involving evaporative cooling chambers where water's evaporation drew heat away from nearby containers. Historians still argue whether these were isolated curiosities or part of widespread practice, but they underscore the Persian penchant for innovation. You learn of a particularly eccentric inventor who reportedly experimented with mixing crushed ice and powdered alum inside sealed clay pots, creating a freezing effect stronger than ice alone. Whether fact or legend, the story highlights a culture willing to push boundaries in the pursuit of comfort. As you prepare to leave the shop, you're handed a small sachet of dried rose petals and mint leaves, intended to be added to chilled water for a refreshing sharbat at home. It's a simple reminder, refrigeration in ancient Persia was never just about preservation. It was about enhancing life's pleasures, one cool sip at a time. You step back into the bustling marketplace, the morning sun warming your skin, the promise of another hot day ahead. But now, you carry a little coolness with you, tucked in your palm and in your mind. As the day stretches on and the sun climbs higher, you find yourself wandering toward the outskirts of the city once again, this time toward the countryside where vast orchards and gardens spill out like emerald patches against the dusty earth. Here, the ancient Persians practiced a subtle art, storing fruit and vegetables cool without ice, an essential skill in a land where every drop of water was precious, and where the summer heat could turn produce into mush in hours. You watch as a farmer gently lowers a woven basket filled with ripe melons into a deep underground pit, covered carefully with thick mats and sealed with earth. These subterranean larders, sometimes called kuna, are ingenious in their simplicity, using the Earth's natural insulation to maintain a cooler, more stable temperature. You learn how these pits were often lined with clay mixed with straw to keep moisture balanced, preventing mold while slowing ripening. Nearby, you observe fruit stored inside wind towers, which funnel breezes into shaded rooms where humidity and heat are tempered by hanging wet mats, another example of passive cooling that doesn't rely on ice but on clever architecture. One gardener proudly shows you a small compartment built under a cistern, where cold water dripping slowly cools stone shelves that hold freshly picked pomegranates and figs. The scent of ripe fruit mingles with cool water, a contrast so vivid it almost feels like walking through a living poem. You hear tales of entire villages that used these combined methods to stockpile fruit through summer months, feeding families with fresh produce when the heat was at its peak. But it wasn't just about storage, there was a ritual, almost sacred respect for timing. Fruit had to be picked at precise ripeness, early morning was preferred, and storage containers regularly rotated to ensure nothing spoiled. Sometimes, a rare frost-damaged melon was saved for animal feed or compost, but mostly the system worked remarkably well. Historians still argue whether these methods were inspired by earlier Mesopotamian practices or if they developed independently as adaptations to local conditions. Either way, the result was a sustainable, resourceful system that didn't rely entirely on ice, precious and often scarce, but made the best of what nature provided. As you sit beneath a shady mulberry tree, eating a crisp, cool grape pulled from a clay jar, you realize that the Persian mastery of cold extended far beyond the yakshal. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, from palace banquets to humble gardens. And it was a reminder that sometimes, the quietest innovations, the ones hidden beneath the earth or flowing with the breeze, are the most profound. You lean back, eyes closing briefly, as the cool shade and faint rustle of leaves lull you. And you understand, the art of keeping cool was, above all, an art of harmony. The sun begins to lower once more, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold as you return to the heart of the city. The narrow streets are alive with the gentle bustle of families gathering for evening meals and storytellers settling into their favorite corners. Your thoughts drift to the social rituals surrounding ice and cold in ancient Persia, how this elusive chill was woven into the very fabric of hospitality and celebration. You're invited into a grand home where a dinner party is underway, the air heavy with the scent of spiced lamb and fresh herbs. The host proudly displays an ornate brass tray set with small dishes of chilled treats, pomegranate seeds dusted with sugar, rosewater-soaked dates, and slices of cucumbers sprinkled with dried mint. Cold dishes like these were more than just refreshment, they were symbols of generosity and refinement. You listen as the host explains that in Persian culture, serving chilled foods and drinks was a sign of respect, especially during the scorching summer months. Offering ice or cool desserts to guests wasn't simply practical, it was a way of showing you cared deeply about their comfort. This made sense, considering the effort involved in procuring ice or preparing frozen desserts. It was a luxury and a gesture wrapped into one. You recall a curious story about the legendary Persian ruler Shah Abbas the Great, said to have insisted on having fresh ice delivered daily during summer, transported hundreds of miles from mountain caves. Whether myth or fact, it illustrates how ice became a mark of power and prestige, accessible mostly to the elite. But cold hospitality wasn't confined to the palaces. In marketplaces, you observe vendors selling iced sherbets and chilled nuts, offering relief to weary travelers and merchants. Street vendors would break large blocks of ice into small pieces to sprinkle over fruit or crush for cooling drinks. You note a peculiar tradition. During the Persian festival of Yalda, celebrated on the longest night of the year, families gather to share stories, poetry, and a spread of cold foods like watermelon and pomegranate. Historians still argue whether these foods symbolized the triumph of light over darkness or were simply seasonal delights made possible by preserved ice and cold storage. Either way, cold was intertwined with culture, ritual, and even spirituality. You find yourself thinking about the poets and philosophers of Persia, who often used cold as a metaphor, sometimes for purity, sometimes for longing, sometimes for the fleeting nature of life. In one whispered verse you overhear, a lover compares her cool hand to the refreshing ice of the desert, a momentary relief against the burning heat of passion and separation. It strikes you how intimately the Persians connected the physical sensation of cold with emotion and meaning. As night deepens, you're gently reminded that ice in ancient Persia was never just a frozen block. It was a symbol of care, a bridge between nature's extremes, and an invitation to savor both the world's heat and its fleeting coolness. You lean back on your cushion, the sounds of laughter and conversation surrounding you like a warm blanket, chilled drinks glinting softly in the candlelight. And for a moment, you feel part of that timeless exchange, one built on generosity, ingenuity, and the simple joy of cooling down. The city slowly quiets as night deepens, but you find your thoughts turning toward the scientific understanding behind the ancient Persian cooling methods, the delicate dance of physics and nature that made refrigeration possible long before electricity or modern technology. You imagine standing inside a yakshal, the thick walls of special mortar drawing in the dry desert air. That same mortar, known as saruj, was a secret blend of clay, lime, sand, and egg whites, creating an incredibly durable and water-resistant surface. This combination kept moisture out and prevented heat from seeping in. You can almost feel the temperature dropping, a cool hush enveloping the interior. You're told how the design cleverly used convection currents, warm air rising through the dome's vents, pulling cooler air in from below, to maintain a steady internal chill. This passive air circulation is a kind of natural ventilation, long before fans or pumps. In fact, some of the early Persian engineers were so attuned to these principles that their yakshals had multiple vent shafts, adjustable flaps, and even reflective surfaces to minimize sun exposure. You try picturing the sun bouncing off the white dome, almost blinding in its brightness, but beneath, an oasis of cold. Your guide explains that the bottom chambers of the yakshal were sometimes dug deep into the ground, where temperatures remain relatively stable year-round, further enhancing the refrigeration effect. It's a reminder that ancient technology often worked by harmonizing with the environment rather than fighting it. You recall reading about similar designs in other cultures, the ice houses of Rome, the snow pits of Japan, and the cold rooms in medieval Europe. Yet, the Persian approach was uniquely adapted to the desert climate, combining materials science with architectural genius. Historians still argue how widely knowledge of saruj and yakshal construction spread, but there's no doubt that Persian builders set a high standard for cooling architecture. You're shown a rough sample of saruj mortar, its texture gritty yet cohesive. Handling it, you appreciate the craftsmanship involved in mixing it to just the right consistency. A quirky detail emerges: some craftsmen reportedly added goat hair to the mixture, which acted like tiny reinforcements, much like fiberglass in modern concrete. You chuckle softly, imagining ancient builders tossing goat hair into their mortar like a secret recipe ingredient. As the night grows deeper, you consider how much of this knowledge was closely guarded, passed down through apprenticeships and family workshops. In fact, some of the yakshal's mysteries remain unsolved even today, prompting ongoing debates among scholars about precise building methods and materials. One thing is certain: these ancient engineers understood the principles of insulation and heat transfer so well, their structures endured for centuries, some still standing proudly in Iran's deserts. You feel a quiet awe for the delicate balance of art and science that made refrigeration possible in a time when the desert seemed a natural enemy of cold. And as you settle in for the night, you carry with you the cool wisdom of those who learned to tame heat with nothing but earth, stone, and patience. The quiet of night deepens, and your mind drifts toward the more delicate side of Persian refrigeration, the culinary arts where ice and cold were ingredients in their own right, shaping flavors and textures in surprising ways. You imagine stepping into a royal kitchen, warm with the scent of cardamom and rose water, where cooks prepare delicacies designed to delight and cool the palate. One of the most intriguing treats is faluda, a semi-frozen dessert made from thin vermicelli noodles mixed with rosewater syrup and crushed ice. Its texture is slippery and smooth, the flavors fragrant but subtle, a perfect counterbalance to the harsh desert heat. You're told that faluda dates back centuries, its recipe evolving alongside the yakshal's development. The ice for these desserts wasn't just stored, it was meticulously harvested and crushed to a fine consistency, often mixed with fruit juices or herbs for added refreshment. You can almost taste the delicate sweetness as the cook sprinkles a bit of lime juice over a serving, the sourness awakening your senses. The culinary use of ice wasn't limited to desserts. Cold meat dishes, chilled soups, and iced sherbets infused with mint and saffron were staples at Persian feasts. You hear a story about a famous chef who served a dish of cold lamb infused with quince, its chill enhancing the meat's tender flavor, a combination still celebrated in Iranian cuisine today. Historians still debate the extent to which these recipes were widespread versus reserved for the elite, but it's clear that ice was a prized culinary tool. Another quirky detail: cooks sometimes used crushed ice not only to chill food but to alter textures, a precursor to modern culinary science. In one experiment, ground ice was mixed with pounded nuts and fruit to create a semi-frozen paste, soft but firm, serving as a refreshing palate cleanser between courses. You laugh softly at the idea of ancient Persian chefs as early food scientists, experimenting with cold like alchemists searching for the perfect balance. The use of rosewater and other floral essences in cold desserts also speaks to Persian sensibilities, appreciating subtlety, aroma, and the gentle layering of tastes. Ice was not merely a practical necessity, it was an artistic medium, a way to surprise and soothe guests. As the kitchen quiets down, you think about how these frozen treats might have felt to ancient Persians, a rare luxury that offered a brief escape from the relentless heat. And you realize how deeply intertwined ice was with pleasure, hospitality, and creativity. In the dim candlelight, you savor the memory of cool sweets and imagine the joy of sharing them in the warm glow of a Persian evening. The night is near its deepest point when your thoughts turn toward the logistics and labor behind ancient Persian refrigeration, the unseen human effort and social organization required to harvest, transport, and store ice and chilled goods. You picture a group of workers setting out before dawn, heading toward mountain peaks where winter snow had accumulated in thick layers. Their tools are simple but effective: wooden sledges, leather bags, and woven baskets. The air is crisp and biting, a stark contrast to the desert heat that awaits below. These men and women carve blocks of ice carefully, using saws and chisels, then wrap them in layers of straw and hides to insulate against melting. The journey back to the city is long and treacherous, sometimes taking days. You imagine the slow caravan winding through rocky passes, the ice carefully shielded from sun and heat. The workers rest often, replenishing their supplies with tea brewed from wild herbs. Despite the hardship, their task was vital. Without them, the city's cooling systems and feasts would falter. You hear how this labor was often seasonal, with communities organizing ice harvesting in winter and then storing supplies underground or in yakshils for use through summer. It was a rhythm attuned to nature's cycles, a blend of human endurance and environmental respect. Curiously, some records hint at the use of camels or donkeys to carry ice, but historians still argue whether these animals were more for carrying equipment or the ice itself. The role of women in this process is less documented, though some suggest that women managed the ice storage in households, carefully rationing it through hot months. You can almost hear their quiet negotiations over how best to stretch the ice's use, part of a domestic choreography unseen by outsiders. The coordination needed to supply a city like Persepolis or Yazd with fresh ice was impressive, involving farmers, laborers, artisans, and merchants. It hints at a complex economy built around refrigeration, with its own networks and traditions. A quirky note: some ice harvesters were reportedly paid in cooled drinks or desserts, an early form of incentive you might call cold cash. As dawn approaches, you feel a quiet respect for the unseen hands that made the Persian chill possible, transforming nature's gift into a communal treasure. Their work was the foundation beneath the marble palaces and fragrant gardens, proof that even the most elegant innovations depend on human grit. You rest your thoughts on this humble labor, feeling the coolness of night wrap softly around you. The first light of dawn begins to brush the horizon with pale gold, signaling the close of your journey through the ancient Persian world of ice and refrigeration. You reflect on how this story is not just about cold blocks stored beneath sun-baked domes, but about a delicate harmony between environment, human ingenuity, culture, and comfort. From the towering Yakshals standing proud in the desert, to the hidden underground pits cooling fragrant fruits, the Persian methods combine science, art, and community. You think about the intricate architecture, the clever use of materials like saruj mortar, and the elegant ventilation systems that brought natural air currents to work in their favor. The artisans who mixed mortar with egg whites and goat hair, the laborers who harvested ice from distant mountains, and the chefs who crafted delicate frozen desserts, each played a part in this quiet legacy. You recall the social rituals, from grand feasts serving iced sherbets to festival gatherings where cold fruits symbolized renewal and hope. And the poetry, weaving the sensation of cold into metaphors of love, longing, and life's fleeting moments. Historians still debate many details, from the precise building techniques of Yakshals to the full extent of ice's role in daily Persian life. But perhaps the most important truth is the spirit behind these inventions, a deep desire to find relief, beauty, and pleasure in a harsh and demanding landscape. As you gently close this chapter, let the cool whispers of Persian deserts and ancient ingenuity settle softly around you. Imagine the soft breeze slipping through wind towers, the faint crunch of ice under tender tongs, the sweet fragrance of rosewater in chilled water. And know that while technology has changed, the human craving for comfort, refreshment, and a moment of cool calm remains unchanged. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and your breath slows, let this story become a gentle lullaby. May the enduring chill of the ancient Persian ice houses soothe you into a peaceful sleep, carrying you softly through the night. The night deepens now, and you find yourself sinking deeper into calm. The cool shadows of the desert stretch long and still, the heat finally softened into a gentle memory. You breathe slowly, your body heavy and relaxed, the mind quiet and drifting. Imagine the soft touch of cold stone beneath your fingertips, the delicate scent of blooming roses carried by a night breeze. You feel the patience of the ancient builders, their quiet wisdom etched into every dome and pit, a promise of respite and peace. There's no rush here, no urgency, only the slow, soothing rhythm of cool air moving softly, carrying away the day's warmth and cares. Let yourself float on this gentle current, the whisper of history humming low and steady, a timeless comfort. Sleep now, cradled by the stories of desert ice and the kindness of cool shadows. Rest easy, and dream sweetly.